As it became obvious that Japan was going to be defeated, the Soviets finally committed forces in the Pacific. Even though it was only a token show of support, Soviet forces moved into Korea. When the Japanese forces were defeated there, they surrendered to both the US and Soviets, which gave the Russians the grounds to claim post-war control of the half of Korea north of the 38th parallel. After the war, the US and Soviets established regimes on their respective sides of the 38th parallel. They shipped in weapons and supplies, and provided military training. With tensions rising in Korea between the two Cold War adversaries, the US decided to withdraw its troops from South Korea to avoid conflict. But all this did was send a message to North Korea that the South was ripe for the taking. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea. Within days, the overwhelmed South Korean military had been chased to the coastal town of Busan and had its back to the wall. It was obvious, without outside intervention, they would be slaughtered, and another democratic country would fall to the red tide. Only 2 months prior to the invasion, the U.S. National Security Council had proposed a huge increase in U.S. military spending to enable the country to enforce its containment policy. Congress, however, shelved the recommendations, but after the North Korean invasion, President Truman dusted off the proposal and called for a 350% increase in the military budget and a buildup of troops. The U.S. also authored a UN Security Council proposal that condemned North Korea's aggression. A resolution was unanimously passed by all 9 attending nations. The Soviet representative was conspicuously absent the day of the vote.
We have actively sought and are actively seeking to make the United Nations an effective instrument of international cooperation. Dean Acheson.
The open-ended UN resolution gave Truman the ability to act with the military without declaring war. So, without consulting Congress, he ordered Air Force, Naval, and Army troops under the command of General Douglas Macarthur to support the South Koreans.
Harry S. Truman.
China had been an easy victory for the Soviets, and the U.S. had steered clear. Now the Soviets were forcing the issue in Korea, and the U.S. recognized they were going to have to take a strong stand. Soon after North Korea invaded the South, they threatened to overrun the country. The situation was desperate, and only U.S. intervention could prevent annihilation. As the U.S. General Douglas MacArthur began exploring plans to rescue the South Koreans, he realized meeting the North Koreans head-on would be costly. Instead, he devised a bold plan to launch an amphibious assault at the rear of North Korean lines, near Incheon. It worked brilliantly. The North Koreans suffered heavy casualties and were soon driven back across the 38th parallel. Now it was decision time. Truman had only wanted to contain North Korea and restore the original border. But seeing an opportunity to prevent future North Korean invasions, he allowed UN forces to enter the north. However, they were ordered not to engage any Soviet or Chinese forces. MacArthur readily accepted this limitation because he did not believe the Chinese or Soviets would enter the fight. Meeting only weak resistance, UN troops advanced far into the north. The advance was so rapid, supply lines were unable to keep up. As the advance continued, the Chinese sent several warnings ordering the UN troops to retreat back below the 38th parallel. MacArthur, however, still did not believe they would face off with his troops. But when 300,000 Chinese forces came rushing into North Korea, the overextended UN forces were sent reeling. MacArthur was humiliated by the defeat. As he urged his troops to cling to their foxholes, he called on Washington to bomb Chinese bases. But Truman was leery to spread the battle into China. There was great concern the Soviets would also join in and retaliate in Europe and other areas of Asia. The fear of igniting another world war led Truman and the UN to order MacArthur to fight a limited war. No nuclear weapons could be used, no attacks into China were allowed, and the ultimate goal was to restore the original border.
Under present circumstances, we have recommended against enlarging the war from Korea to also include Red China. The course of action, often described as a limited war with Red China, would increase the risk we are taking by engaging too much of our power in an area that is not the critical strategic prize. Red China is not the powerful nation seeking to dominate the world. Frankly, in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this strategy would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. General Omar Bradley, May 15, 1951.
MacArthur was furious. He believed this would hamstring his army and prevent victory. The general began publicly criticizing Truman's policies. Eventually, his statements became so bold, Truman believed he had no choice but to relieve Macarthur from command.
It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General Macarthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
Despite his failures and disagreements, Macarthur returned home to a hero's welcome.
General Douglas MacArthur.
As MacArthur drew applause, Truman was becoming viewed as a fool and a communist sympathizer. And all the while, the fighting continued. The fighting in Korea became very draining on America. The absence of clear, significant goals and the lack of a decisive victory prevented the American people from rallying behind the cause, as they had in World War II. While the fighting dragged on, President Truman worked tirelessly to resolve the conflict. But doubts had been raised. The war and its course had made him widely unpopular.
Truman lost his temper. MacArthur lost his job. Atchison lost his war. 1.5 million people lost their lives, and Stalin didn't even lose a night's sleep. New York Herald Tribune, April 6, 1964.
As a result of his unpopularity, Truman decided not to seek re-election in 1952. Americans wanted an end to the Korean conflict, and the former commander of Allied forces in Europe, five-star General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was promising to provide exactly that. He was elected president in 1952 and immediately traveled to Korea to take control of peace talks. Eisenhower found the negotiations as difficult as Truman had. As progress was stymied, he decided to play a big card to force the communists to negotiate in earnest. When Ike threatened to use atomic weapons, both sides stood up and took notice. Negotiations suddenly advanced rapidly, and a ceasefire between North and South Korea was signed on July 27, 1953. The truce agreement restored the 38th parallel as the dividing boundary and established a 2.5-mile wide demilitarized zone, or DMZ, the length of the 155-mile border. Both sides quickly fortified their sides of the DMZ. Though the fighting had come to an end, many Americans were left with a very bad taste in their mouths over the results of the conflict. Nearly 37,000 U.S. soldiers had sacrificed their lives. Another 100,000 were injured. In addition, more than 1.5 million North Korean and Chinese troops and more than 2 million Korean civilians were killed. This huge loss of life, given to simply restore the original border, left most Americans believing the conflict had been ineffective, pointless, and very costly. By others, it was considered a loss.
I return with feelings of misgiving from my third war. I was the first American commander to put his signature to a paper ending a war when we did not win it. General Mark W. Clark, October 21st, 1953.
Despite the devastating loss of life and the lack of a clear victory, the Korean War did accomplish one significant goal. The U.S. showed that it was willing and able to back up its containment policy to halt the spread of communism. The Soviets and Chinese found that the West would stand up to their aggressions and were willing to pay great costs to do so. As a result, a military buildup began to escalate, and another small country in Southeast Asia would become the next Cold War battleground.